So then in terms of, you know, translating your research into a paradigm of activism, what sort of guidelines or suggestions would you have for emerging academics who want to do the same thing? They don't want
Yeah.
to produce the knowledge, but they want to take that knowledge and try to make a difference in the world. What would you suggest for them?
Well, first of all, I'll just say that my students just blow me away. I'm a professor at UVic and in gender studies, and I'm sure it's the same in your department. This is a period of intense activism, whether we're talking about, all the different social justice movements we're seeing right now around Black Lives Matter, Wet'suwet'en Strong. There's so much decolonizing, um, and I think that I have a lot to learn from this generation of students, and have learned so much. But what I've always tried to impress upon my students is that these seemingly very boring, dry, ivory tower kind of skills we're learning can have an impact in more kind of social justice settings. And so I always use this example that whoever thinks they're going to use an annotated bibliography in real life, well, I got to do that through these FDA hearings where I was able to submit an annotated bibliography of all the sources demonstrating the very social and political factors that can diminish sexual desire. And I got to use that in this kind of real world setting. And so that's just one example, but there are so many kinds of forms of critical thinking we do. I think in gender studies today, we don't just do critical thinking around texts. I think that we are really critically engaging with social movements as well. So I teach a class on the pink ribbon breast cancer campaigns, for example, as something we really have to think critically about for so many different reasons. And I think that gender studies students have an edge in that department if they are engaging in social movements. I think that they are able to really think very thoughtfully about, various considerations on how to ethically conduct oneself and put these ideas forward.
Thank you. How did you get connected with like who approached you? How did you get connected with providing testimony?
Yeah, well, that was kind of interesting. So this is, social media existed in 2010, but it wasn't as prevalent. And I think that today it would happen much more through social media channels. We had an old-fashioned listserv. So this was, one person in New York who started a listserv for interested interdisciplinary scholars and activists and health professionals. And that's how we were communicating and sharing information through our Gmail accounts. So that's how it all started. And for me, it felt like real community, because I think when you're doing graduate work in this silo of this very narrow topic, it can be very isolating. So being able to connect, then through a listserv, and I'm sure it would be more through, Instagram or Facebook today. Or I'm sure there's something cooler than that. But that was very helpful. And so that's how that came about. But to be honest, none of us had ever done that work before. And we just started looking at the FDA website and thought, oh, wow, there's a section for public input and it's a lottery, and let's all put ourselves forward for this lottery. And we all got in. And it was really, really an exercise in just try it. You sometimes think, oh, I need a shirt grant. I need all these things in place before I am allowed to act as a as a scholar or as a scholar activist. But no, this was really just using our imaginations and seeing what we could do.
That's fantastic. And the drug wasn't approved, was it?
It was. So the when I testified in 2010, it was not approved.
Okay.
And it was very, I would say, very heavily critiqued by the FDA panel. So that was cool to see. There was another hearing, and that was a very fascinating moment because I got to see in action a new tactic that drug companies are using to over medicalize. And that was there was a section. This hearing really allowed for a lot of patient input, and what they did was drug companies paid patients to come in busloads and give their testimony of the physiological nature of their sexual problems and their deep wish for a drug. And they started to charge the FDA with sexism, saying that men have these drugs, women deserve these drugs. And so we call this an astroturf campaign. It's something that looks like in a grassroots image, but is very contrived by corporations as a marketing strategy. And it was very successful. And this dismally ineffective and potentially dangerous drug was approved as Addy, and then was approved by Health Canada. Addy is a daily use drug, and it increases sexually satisfying events an extra 0.6 per month. So you get not even a full sexually satisfying event for a drug you take every day.
Wow.
And the risks include fainting, dizziness, and it cannot be taken with alcohol, like if you drink at all, or you have a higher risk. So really potentially dangerous. And definitely if we're weighing, with all drugs, we just want to weigh that risk to benefit ratio. And that's something actually that I'll just mention in this interview, especially in the context of COVID and the vaccine and Pfizer and, certain companies that I've heavily critiqued are now hopefully going to be coming through with this vaccine. And drugs are all about the risk to benefit ratio. So if the benefit is there, this is going to be great, obviously. So I just want to mention that because I think people can hear my work and then wonder, oh, is she anti-vax? And I'm absolutely not. I mean, there's a very small number of vaccines that I question a little bit, but yeah, I think that's important to mention in this particular moment in time.
I'm thinking about your work in conversation with the new book that Jane Ward published, The Tragedy of Heterosexuality. I think that's what it's called. And it takes a queer perspective on why a perspective where instead of heterosexual people being queer allies, it's queer people being heterosexual allies. And I think about in terms of, sexual satisfying experiences per month, like a lot of work on gender relations, that assumes probably a heterosexual sexuality. The drug was probably thought about. How just changing dynamics of relationships would probably lead to more trying sexual experiences per month.
Yeah, so the drug was tested on thousands of people in Europe and North America, and they were from all accounts entirely heterosexual in an average relationship length of 11 years. And so that was interesting. And then in my research, in that study, the majority of participants were heterosexual, but in that study, it wasn't so much whether someone was queer or heterosexual that seemed to make the difference in their happiness around sexual dysfunction. It was more about a willingness to challenge heteronormative scripts, regardless of sexual identity. So those people who were less goal-oriented and more open to it should just be about what feels good rather than what is normal, seem to be happier. Whereas there was, for example, one queer woman who was so goal-oriented and so ashamed of her inability to orgasm that kind of countered some of that fluidity. But in my recent work, which is almost 1/2 to 1/3 of the participants are queer identified, you really see a difference in terms of like relationship to these PCOS traits and the ability to see them in positive terms or to work through some of the stigma and negativity, and people referencing queer community as really helpful in that regard.